From Boyle Heights in Los Angeles, California, Libros, Schmibros Lending Library presents the Latinidad Beyond Borders podcast. Latinidad encompasses the diverse experiences of people who live in Latin America, as well as people of Latin American descent who live in the United States. This podcast explores culture, society, and politics across the Americas through the lens of Latinidad.
Welcome to another episode of Latinidad Beyond Borders. I'm your host, Alberto Sahagún. Today's topic is Venezuela. My guest is Miguel Tinker Salas. He's Emeritus Professor of History at Pomona College, specializing in Latin America and Latino studies. He's written extensively on Venezuela. In 2009, he published The Enduring Legacy: Oil, Culture, and Society in Venezuela. In 2015, he published Venezuela: What Everyone Needs to Know. Welcome to the show.
Muchas gracias. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So it's been about a month since the U.S. attacked Venezuela in an operation to capture, or you might say kidnap, the Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. And he was taken with his wife to the U.S. to face drug trafficking charges. So we've seen that this operation did not change the regime. It changed the leader, but the regime is intact. And this regime has its origins in the presidency of Hugo Chavez, which we'll talk about. But I want to start before that and look at Venezuela in the 80s and 90s, the political and economic situation, which led to the rise of Hugo Chavez and the changes going forward. So, yes, what was Venezuela like during that time in the 80s and 90s?
Well, thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to talk and be able to have a conversation about this very important topic. To understand Venezuela, one needs to understand oil. Oil is at the cornerstone of the Venezuelan economy, Venezuelan society, and is critical for any understanding of the country's history, legacy, past, present, and more than likely future. It has the largest oil reserves in the world, 303 billion barrels of oil that have been certified. And that's critical to understanding the expectations that people in Venezuela have concerning oil. Many people in Venezuela see oil as their birthright, as the patrimony of the nation that should be transferred into hospitals and schools and freeways and social services and projects. And that's the Venezuela that existed in the 70s and 80s, except that oil also has another phenomena. There's a boom-bust cycle. Oil is not simply the progression from point X to point Y and to Z. Oil undergoes tremendous boom-bust cycles. In Venezuela, throughout its entire history, with the discovery of oil, has undergone a series of boom-bust cycles. In 1973, with the Arab oil embargo, Venezuela had a boom period because as the Arabs cut back on the production of oil, Venezuela increased production of oil and the price of oil went up. During the 1980s, the opposite happened with the Trans-Alaska pipeline, with new oil deposits elsewhere in the world. There was a glut of oil on the market. The economy crashed and led in 1989 to the government attempting to impose strict measures, economic measures, neoliberal economic measures, structural adjustment policies, which led to a massive rebellion in February of 1989, known as the Caracazo, where people who had expected to have subsidies to transportation and others found that they were being cut back and impinging upon their standard of living and protested and rebelled. So you see the cycle then. You see the cycle of boom bust. And the expectation that oil would provide the basis for progress, for advancement, for economic advancement, and it doesn't. Instead, what we had was a series of governments that mismanaged oil profits, engaged in corruption, and set the groundwork then in many ways for the social explosion that happened in February of 1989, which is the precursor to the rise of someone named Hugo Chavez.
So what was the state of democracy, you would say, in the 80s and 90s? Did the democratic system represent all the people of Venezuela, or was it dominated by a small class?
Well, we need to go back to 1958 when Venezuela comes out of a dictatorship, and instead Venezuela enters a democratic period in January of 1958, before the Cuban Revolution even had happened, which was 59. In 58, the political parties, the democratic political parties, forged what they called a pacted democracy, a democracy by which they would now accept the results of the ballot box. They would not call upon the military to intercede or resolve their differences. And they excluded the left, which had been a critical element in the ouster of the dictator Marcos Pérez Jiménez. So this is a democracy that then excludes a portion of the population that had invested very much in the ouster of a dictator and thought that with democracy there would be dramatic changes. Instead, what we had was a pacted democracy that resolved internal disputes among the elites, but did not necessarily raise the level of the socioeconomic standard of the population. In fact, in 1961, an Alliance for Progress report said that Venezuela was like a volcano. All it needed was a Castro-type figure to explode. That underscores the fact that there was socioeconomic inequality, that despite oil profits and oil revenue, there was poverty, there was inequality, and social conditions continued to be detrimental to the majority of the population. In 1973, a National Security Council document said that Venezuela had been a nouveau rich country that had gone from the burro to the Cadillac to the jet plane overnight, and had left millions of people in untouched poverty. And that if that wasn't resolved, there would be social tumult in the streets. And there was, except it waited a decade to happen. It was in 1989.
Right. So in 1998, Hugo Chavez is able to win the presidency. So how was he able to do that, uh, given the opposition to him amongst the Venezuelan elites?
Well, because of what happened after 1989. After 1989, with the imposition of structural adjustment policies, with neoliberal economic policies, with a cutback in social benefits and programs, the country experienced again this bust cycle, and corruption continued to happen. Banks collapsed, insurance companies collapsed. The promise of development, the promise of change, the promise of oil was not fulfilled. And someone like Hugo Chavez, who had first participated in a coup in 1992, two coups in 1992 to try to oust the government, claiming that it was illegitimate, set the stage then. And he was arrested, put in jail, eventually pardoned by Rafael Caldera, the president, and then became part of a movement which he called the Bolivarian movement, drawing inspiration from Simón Bolívar, the leader of independence, taking the progressive aspects of Simón Bolívar and trying to weave them into the history of Venezuela to try to respond to their interests and the concerns. And this was critical because as the other parties lost prestige, lost support, his movement, the Bolivarian movement, gradually gained support. And he was very clear about his intentions when he ran for office. He said he was against neoliberalism. He was for a multipolar world. That meant that the U.S. would not be at the center of the world that Venezuela functioned in. Instead, it would be a multipolar world where there would be opportunities for interchange with Asia, with Africa, with Europe, and the U.S., of course. And the population gravitated towards his proposal. They had seen already what neoliberal economic policy looked like. They had seen the curtailment of social benefits. They had seen an elite that was more interested in preserving their status and their wealth, and they had seen the corruption. So Chavez seemed like an alternative to that, and he thus was elected in 1998, assuming office in 1999, and doing what he said he wanted to do, which was rewrite the Venezuelan constitution to promote the notion of participatory democracy, not simply representative democracy.
Right. And in 2002, there was a coup attempt. So what led to that, and what do we know about how much the U.S. was involved in that?
In 2002, as you said, there was a coup. They had been building, the Constitution was supported by a large segment of the population, the 1999 Constitution. Voter turnout was not exceedingly high, but it was important enough to pass the Constitution. In 2001, Chavez promoted a series of leyes habilitantes, or enabling laws, that tried to close the gap that was left for the nationalization of oil, to ensure that oil was for Venezuelans in Venezuela, and not for foreign oil companies who had historically had a privileged position in the country. He passed labor reforms, land reforms, artisan fishery reforms, and others. And those reforms were rejected by elites who talked about the fact that the oil company needed to be separate from the state, that Chavez was trying to take over the oil company and take over its profits. And yes, the government wanted to take over the oil company, the national oil company, PDVSA, because it was the purse strings of the nation. And to have social reform, you needed access to those funds and to those profits, and reinvestment for the country. And that was the straw that broke the camel's back for the elites. They moved and had a segment of the military support them, and they staged a coup. What they didn't expect was the outpouring of support that Chavez had, and that evoked a response within the military itself that divided and split. Young officers and the security detail that surrounded the president were supportive of him, as were hundreds of thousands of individuals who had voted for Chavez and now wanted him returned. This was the first coup that was reverted. A coup usually means that a president is ousted, and the military takes over. This was the first time that a coup against a standing president had been reverted, and Chavez resumed power within 3 days.
Right. And what about the U.S.? What kind of involvement was there from the 90s into the 2000s? And how did they view Hugo Chavez? So George W. Bush was president during most of the 2000s. So how do you see that?
Well, no, the U.S. definitely had forewarning of the coup. For many of us, they had green lighted the coup. It's unlikely that the military or a faction of the military would have acted without having been green lighted by the U.S. The Bush administration clearly rejoiced in the coup. Their secretary of journalism, of press, said Chavez brought this upon himself. Subsequently, with his return, Condoleezza Rice and Colin Powell and others in the administration sought to insulate Latin America from Chavez. They saw it as a contagion. They talked about the need to insulate Latin America. They treated it as it was a disease, that Chavismo was a disease, because what they were worried about was that the example of what was happening in Venezuela could be followed by other countries. The Chavez movement was very critical, important, in as much as it rejected what had been happening in the past, guerrilla movements, violence, etc. It saw that change could happen through the ballot box. It saw that change could happen through the democratic system. And this was critical because not much shortly thereafter, we saw countries like Brazil elect Lula. We saw countries like Ecuador elect Correa, Bolivia elect Morales, Argentina elect the Kirchners. So we saw what was called a pink tide in Latin America, an effort to reform the countries democratically, to try to make the countries more resemble the needs of the population and the concerns. And the U.S. saw that as a threat. And they saw the threat coming from Venezuela. Although these were movements, Venezuela had very little to do what was happening in Brazil, what was happening in Chile, what was happening in Ecuador or Bolivia. These were very much movements that happened naturally, organically in these countries as well, given the fact that the one commonality they all had was that neoliberal economic policies and structural adjustment policies had been imposed on these countries by the World Bank and by other lending institutions. So to that extent, it was very critical what was happening in Venezuela served as an example. And we saw the rise of new institutions. We saw the rise of the Community of Latin American and Caribbean Nations as an alternative to the OAS. We saw the rise of the UNASUR, the Union of South America, that sought to integrate the countries of South America. And we saw changes that we had not seen previously. We saw a reduction in poverty in Venezuela. We saw a reduction of poverty in Brazil. We saw a reduction of poverty in other countries. We saw the empowerment of sectors of the population, the indigenous communities, the Afro-Latino communities, women, workers, peasants, others. We saw a level of empowerment that we had not seen previously in that period of time.
So Chavez was president until 2013 when he passed away from illness. And some accounts of his presidency would say that over time he became more authoritarian, more corrupt. How do you see the evolution of his presidency?
Well, I think that one of the weaknesses of Chavismo was the other part of the Chavismo we need to keep in mind is that it also it empowered sectors of society that had never been empowered previously to the same level. That is, comunas, communes. We saw the establishment of communes in the urban areas and the rural areas where people in neighborhoods took control of their neighborhoods, began to promote healthcare services, educational services through a program called Missions. The criticism of Chavez that I have personally was what I call what's called hyper presidentialism. This was the movement itself was hard to separate from Hugo Chavez the person, and that's both a strength and a weakness because most movements have organic leaders, and Chavez, without a doubt, was an organic leader that came out of the same population that he now claimed to represent. But in creating this kind of hyper presidentialism, you create the inevitable figure. And without that figure, the movement then suffers. And when he passed away, there was a tremendous outpouring. But you can't transfer that kind of power. You can't transfer that kind of charisma. You have to earn it yourself. And before he passed away, he did ask his followers to support Nicolas Maduro, the foreign secretary, as his successor. He knew his time was limited, and he asked them to support Nicolas Maduro. But Nicolas Maduro was not a Chavez. He was not the same figure. And increasingly, I should also point out that during Chavez and during Maduro, we had a very, very strident opposition, an opposition that was willing to call for coups, an opposition that was willing to call for insurrections against Chavez, insurrections against Maduro. Shortly after Maduro was elected, the opposition called for la salida, the ouster, by any means necessary. They took over neighborhoods, they took over communities, they blockaded streets, they blockaded freeways, they tried to make the conditions of ungovernability. That increased then on the part of the state. The state had to respond to maintain its legitimacy and to maintain its power, and there were excesses. Undoubtedly as a result of that. But let's be clear, the opposition was not a peaceful opposition at all times. This was an opposition that varied from very direct actions of insurrection and other times to participating in elections. There was an old adage among some Venezuelans that Chavez's greatest supporters or Chavez's greatest ally was the opposition because they never had a proposal for what was going to be changed in Venezuela, how they would bring about change and how they would incorporate the demands. So some of them proposed the idea of a Chavez light. Others proposed the idea of simply eradicating Chavismo, cutting it out as if it was a cancer in society, not recognizing that it responded to needs in the society, not understanding that many Venezuelans supported it because they saw their lives improved. And that's what many of them feared.
Yeah, so Nicolas Maduro, there's an election in 2013 for president after Chavez died. And Maduro wins, but in a narrow margin, and begins his presidency, where up until January 3rd, he was president for about 12, 13 years. So now looking back at his presidency, which I think clearly there was many troubles in the economy, there was migration out of the country. So how do we assess his presidency, given also the effects of U.S. policy and the opposition?
Without a doubt, Maduro faced a much different political context than Hugo Chavez had. But the writing was on the wall. The U.S. sought to impose sanctions on Venezuela. Those sanctions begin gradually in 2015 with Barack Obama, who imposed the same day that he opened up relations with Cuba to a certain extent while keeping the embargo. He also declared that Venezuela was a clear and present danger to the U.S., understanding that its Navy never could reach the U.S., its Air Force was limited, could never reach the U.S., but nonetheless, he was willing to call Venezuela a clear and present danger and began imposing sanctions on Venezuela. And those sanctions were meant to strangulate the economy. When Trump comes to office, those sanctions increased dramatically. They particularly deal with oil in 2019. And sanctions kill. Let's be clear about what the role of sanctions are. It's the same sanctions that are being applied to Cuba right now. As we speak, Trump has imposed tariffs on any country that trades oil with Cuba. The idea is to strangulate the economy, knowing full well that in the case of Venezuela, the country depends on oil profits for 97% of its foreign revenue. So in that context, it's very clear what the intention was. That together with mismanagement, the lack of expertise in some cases in the oil industry, wide-scale corruption. Two leaders of the petroleum company, PDVSA, were accused of stealing millions and millions in dollars and have never actually been held accountable. One of them was fled the country, one of them was arrested. So that a combination of factors, on the one hand, sanctions, on the other side, the mismanagement and the corruption led to a dramatic decline in oil production. Venezuela found that it had to sell its oil at a discount to China or to India in order to get around the sanctions and depend on a shadow fleet of tankers to get the oil out of the country. But it exposed the weaknesses. And we saw an increase in authoritarianism on the part of the Maduro government, while at the same time it was being attacked by the opposition, who never accepted his legitimacy.
Yes, and today the face of the opposition is Maria Corina Machado, who she won the Nobel Prize last year, and as we all know, gave the physical prize to Donald Trump. She couldn't run for president in the election of 2024, but the candidate she supported, international accounts of the election say that he won, that Maduro lost by a large margin. But you touched on this before about the opposition not having clear ideas about what they want to do with going forward if they had power. So what do we know about Maria Corina Machado and what she believes in?
Well, Maria Corina Machado starts by being part of an electoral observing organization that she created and she developed. She then is elected into the National Assembly. She had a very public break with Hugo Chavez in which there was an encounter in the National Assembly. She represents one facet of the opposition. Be clear that in Venezuela, there are multiple levels of opposition. She represents the most strident, the most pro-US. She supported the sanctions that hurt the society and the economy. She supported the naval blockade off the coast of Venezuela. She supported the bombing of Venezuela. She supported the invasion of Venezuela and the kidnapping of Nicolas Maduro. She supported various levels of insurrection in the country. So many of us were surprised that after having supported insurrection in the country, she would be given a Nobel Peace Prize. But again, there's multiple levels of opposition in Venezuela. There are the most right strident opposition. There is a more moderate opposition that sees the need to engage in conversation and negotiation with the Chavistas, understanding that they are a portion of the population. There is a left opposition to Nicolas Maduro that criticizes his betrayal of the Chavista for the Chavista principles by freezing salaries by having free trade zones where unions aren't allowed to organize, his anti-labor and anti-union position. So there is a multiple opposition in Venezuela that must be taken into account in dealing with what happens in the future of Venezuela. But one thing is clear, Corina Machado represented a sufficient enough of a change that even the Trump administration opted to work within the existing power structures in order to try to maintain a control of the country after the kidnapping of the president.
Final question. So the president of Venezuela now is Delcy Rodriguez, and she seems to be working with the Trump administration. The Trump administration also seems to be moving on to other countries and other topics. So how do you see the year playing out in Venezuela with Delcy in charge?
Well, it's the strangest of relationships. You have a president in the U.S., Donald Trump, who claims to be the president of Venezuela. You have a Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, that's acting as if he was the vice president of Venezuela or the viceroy of the Caribbean, because he also has his eye on Cuba and Nicaragua. And you have then Delcy Rodriguez, who is a socialist, whose father was a former Marxist, who is now in charge of Venezuela as the acting viceroy or the acting. It's the strangest of relationships in which you have a country who claims to be socialist in a neo-colonial relationship because Washington is making the decisions. Washington is making decisions of where they can sell their oil. There's little or no transparency, we should be clear on. Millions of dollars are being exchanged. They're being deposited in bank accounts in Qatar, where there's little or no accountability. There seems to be an interest in having accountability for the U.S., but the Venezuelans would like to know accountability as well. There's a sense of expectation in Venezuela that oil will be pumped again, and that the sanctions will be relieved. That flights will now begin to happen directly between the U.S. and Venezuela, which have been sanctioned up until now. So there's a sense of expectation, but that can only go so far and so long. There has to be fundamental change. There has to be an opening, a democratic opening. There has to be an opportunity to resolve the differences that have happened between Venezuelans themselves. There has to be a new national consciousness developed, a new national social contract. So I think that although we have great expectations right now, people in Venezuela are hoping for the best. But again, they also want free and clear democratic elections, and they want to be ruled by, and the decisions want to be made in Venezuela, not in Washington.
Thank you so much for coming on. That was very informative.
Thank you very much, and wish you all the very best at the Lending Library.
Thank you.